So during the morning, we saw, about 30 companies come up and present at various stages of innovation and development, and having made many of those presentations over the last 8 years or so at OIS, I'd like to congratulate the courage, somewhat, creativity, and the persistence that's required to get these companies to the levels that these presenters have done. I also like to, in the context of that, think about in reality how many of these companies ever get to their desired outcomes. We know many will see success, but unfortunately some of them will not as well. And it's in that context that I would propose to you that Alimera Sciences is one of the few companies, an OIS company, if I may, that has been able to acquire technology, take it through the phase 3 trials required by the regulatory bodies, negotiate the regulatory waters in both the US and Europe, get reimbursement in Europe, get on the managed care formularies in the US, build the infrastructures on both sides of the ocean, and get to the cusp of profitability. And that is the story of Alimera Sciences. As we look at 2018, after a long journey, we believe we'll be profitable in that time. And it's a very proud day for me to talk about our 150 employees in both the US and Europe who have contributed mightily to that. We've accomplished that through being in a very large space. As many of you know, DME is a very large market. We're changing the paradigm for a chronic disease to be treated in a chronic way. And both from the footprint growth in the EU internationally as well as organic growth, we're seeing great strides in our quarterly sales as well as year over year, and I'll show that in just a moment. And I'm very, very fortunate to have people like Rick Eisworth, our president, CFO, and his team, and it's only as good as you people are, so I'm very pleased with that. Just a quick tutorial on Iluvien. As many of you may know, it's a non-erodible 3-millimeter tube that contains 190 micrograms of fluocinoloneacetonide, a steroid, for the treatment of DME. We're able to give, as Nancy Lurker mentioned this morning, this is a technology we acquired from Savita, a constant zero kinetic release of 0.2 micrograms per day over the course of 3 years. This is an obvious win for the patient. Instead of having monthly injections of anti-VEGFs or bi-monthly or even quarterly injections of even short-acting steroids, we believe a patient that can get one injection, get continuous daily microdosing over a 3-year period is the optimal way to treat a chronic disease like DME. I was very happy that Jeff and Vicken in their presentation earlier this morning had done some of the work for me on this slide, and that I think it's becoming relatively accepted in the ophthalmic space and the retinal community in general, that this DME is a much more multifactorial disease than the wet AMD space, which we know is very targeted, and the anti-VEGFs work very well. As you can see on the left side of my slide, I'm recalling some of the data that Vicken mentioned this morning. DRCR-NET, Protocol I, and Protocol T reference the fact that about 36 to 56% of patients in DME simply don't respond well enough with monotherapy of these anti-VEGFs, and we know that. Obviously, that's because part of the issue is there's an inflammatory component, we believe, to DME that the steroids treat. Now, as I said, we've known that for a while, but the dilemma we faced at Alimera was we've been at this for quite some time, as many of you know, and our trial was completed unmasked in 2009. At that time, the anti-VEGFs were not approved for the use in DME, nor was Ozurdex for that matter, and so there was no comparative data for Iluvien with the anti-VEGF therapy. And so even if a doctor fundamentally and psychologically kind of came along with the thought that I'm going to have to think about combination therapy, there was really very little data. And as most of you would probably agree, it's a pretty big ask for a doctor to take a patient who's doing well on certain therapies, move them to a long-term low-dose steroid, which is Iluvien, without data. And so I'm extremely pleased to tell you this is by far our biggest AAO. We'll have over 10 papers and presentations on the use in real-world data of Iluvien in combination or subsequent to the anti-VEGF therapy. I'm not going to go into most of those here, but I do want to speak to one that I'm particularly excited about, and I know our sales force is very excited about, and this is called the user study. It was enrolling patients who had received Iluvien at 4 major centers after we launched in the spring of 2015. As you can see from the very top up there, it's 130 patients with 160 eyes, and they had to have been enrolled prior to January 1st of 2016. Now remember, we only launched in the spring of 2015, so these were patients who were very much early on and early adopters of Iluvien. Notice one thing right away, 130 eyes were represented by 130 patients. So in the first 9 months, we had 25% of the patients who either had enjoyed the benefit of the compliance side or the efficacy side of Iluvien said that they had now had bilateral treatments in both eyes within 9 months. When I saw this data analyzed, I was very pleased to see that spoke volumes to me about the patient acceptance and the physician acceptance. If you look down below, you'll see from left to right, we measured in this trial what you might expect: ocular outcomes, the visual acuity of the patients, the treatment burden reduction or treatment frequency reduction, and then of course we know the one Achilles heel of steroids, generally speaking, is the assumption that intraocular pressure rise will occur with steroids. And so let me take you just through 2 quick slides. The first is most important. Of those 160 eyes, only 37% had to have any additional therapy once they got Iluvien. Said another way, and much more in favor of Iluvien, 63% of patients who got an Iluvien implant never had to have any other therapy during the course of the trial, which of course has now been roughly 15 to 18 months of follow-up. So we think that bodes very well for the concept of this paradigm shift. Of the 37%, as you might suspect, the great majority got additional anti-VEGF therapy. Some got even short-acting steroids, and a few, 10%, did get laser therapy. This looks like a busy slide, but I'll do it very quickly for you. What we did in this slide is we took these 160 eyes and we stratified them by the visual acuity that they had coming into the trial. So let's talk about just the top line for a moment. The green line represents patients who are actually seeing very well. These are patients who are seeing 20/40 or better, which, as we know, are still mobile. They still have their driver's license. And they were seeing approximately 70 to 72 letters of visual improvement on the ETDRS chart. You see the dotted line there. They received an Iluvien. And for the 15-month follow-up after Iluvien, notice what happened to their vision. It stayed just where it was before. I think this is going to be some of the most interesting information for retinal physicians to think about, and that even after a patient was doing well on anti-VEGF, not a non-responder, they were getting an injection, as you can see on the left there, an average of about 2.9 injections every 3 months to get that kind of visual acuity. After getting Iluvien, their vision maintained, and yet they were getting an injection only once, an additional anti-VEGF, or steroid, or laser, once every 22 months. We reduced the treatment burden for these patients by 75%, and yet their vision didn't suffer at all. I think this is a huge finding that we're very excited about. I won't go through the whole slide, but conversely, if you go to the bottom level, these are patients, unfortunately, who are seeing 2200 or worse. So obviously these are patients in a difficult situation. But notice how often on the left side of the slide they're getting injections. They're getting injections the same amount of time as the patients are doing well. I think this speaks to a bit of the habit we've gotten into with anti-VEGFs, that it's just bring these patients in, we don't know what else to do with them, and we just keep sticking needles in their eyes. If you look at what happened to the patient on the bottom after they got Iluvien, they improved by 4 lines, or almost 3 lines of visual improvement. This was a massive improvement in their visual acuity. Now, granted, if you notice, they still got additional therapies in addition to Iluvien every 6.7 months, but these are patients obviously who are not doing near as well. We think this is very exciting data. Now, you look at OCT because people say, well, that's a more objective view, and there again, after Iluvien, the OCT measures again continue to decline. And then finally, for this data, everyone wants to know about IOP. And if you look at this, in this situation, the patient's IOP didn't go up at all. And that is a measure of what the FDA label that we agreed to back in 2014. Patients in this case were used on label, had a prior course of corticosteroid, did not see an increase in their vision IOP, and maintained that. So the safety side, we think, is going to be very enlightening for doctors who are worried about intraocular pressure. From the commercial status, we're in 7 countries in Europe, the US, and now into the Middle East. The green represents places we have opportunities to move in with a marketing authorization, but have not yet because of cash to do that. Nancy Lurker mentioned this morning about the uveitis indication for Zevita. We are happy that we have acquired the rights to market uveitis in the EU and the MEA, and so we're very excited about filing in the first quarter of this year. We expect to start seeing approvals over the 8 months, and we expect to see additional revenues from uveitis in those markets in 2019. Quickly on the finance side, the revenues continue to grow. We're up 13% year over year. You see, we still face a little bit of a seasonalization as you look at quarters, but all quarters are up. And over year to year, 13% growth. But the real story toward this profitability target is Rick Eisworth really challenged our organization to start looking really hard at non-essential expenses. And by every measure of expense control, you can see we've done quite well in all of these different metrics. And to the point of third quarter, we got very, very close to profitability on an adjusted EBITDA basis. as I said, we think that sets us up and poises us well for moving into 2018, which we think will be our first profitable year at Alimera Sciences. So I welcome you to come by our booth. Our reps are very excited about this new data, and I look forward to keeping you updated as we move forward in 2018.